Supporting Therapist. I am Michelle Lundstrom, and today I am here with the brilliant and talented Dr. Jan Dworkin. And Jan has more than 25 years of international cross-cultural experience as a couples therapist and a leadership coach. And she is the co-founder of the Process Work Institute. And that is a nonprofit graduate school dedicated to research and training in process-oriented psychology. She served as its academic dean for over a decade and continues to teach training workshops worldwide. She coaches leaders and teams across sectors and specializes in conflict facilitation. All right, and she also wrote a really amazing book, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but she is the author of Make Love Better: How to Own Your Story, Connect with Your Partner, and Deepen Your Relationship Practice. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate your inviting me on.
Yes, I'm so happy to have you here today. This is really exciting.
Fun.
All right, well, we'll get into your book in just a moment, but can you just briefly tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, you just said sort of the outer sort of credentials. So what I could add to that is just that I really never, although I've been working for so many years as a therapist and a facilitator, I really never set out to be one. It was really my relationships that led me to becoming a therapist, my relationships and my inner life and my inner work and my interest in my own dreams. So I had the great good fortune after college of following a boyfriend to Zurich, Switzerland, where I had heard about a teacher named Arnie Mindell who was doing this. He was a Jungian analyst who was researching the connection between the mind and the body, and he came up with this idea of the dream body in the late 70s, early 80s, and I was very fortunate to be part of a group of students who were gathering around, learning from this excellent teacher, and I sort of found a path through relationships and through my own inner work, found a professional path. I thought I was going to be a wild, crazy artist, and I never really saw myself as becoming the professional that I've become. So it's been very interesting.
I love that, and I relate to that too.
Oh, good. Yeah, you're an artist too, I know. I love your work. That's right behind you on the screen. It's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. All right, well, I love your work too. I want to talk a little bit about your book, Make Love Better: How to Own Your Story, Connect with Your Partner, and Deepen Your Relationship Practice. Jen, when I read this, I was really blown away of how inclusive you are. And I really loved that. That felt really good to me, and I don't see that in every relationship book. And there was this authenticity and vulnerability from you that just really struck me, and full of so much great content, and you're funny.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I got that feedback that people say my book is kind of laugh out loud at different moments, and I know most people don't expect that from a relationship book, and there's a lot of heaviness and depth in it too, so I think it's kind of a weird mixture. So I don't identify as being that funny, so I really enjoy when people find me funny. That's awesome. Thank you.
Oh, you are funny. And I think that's really so powerful, especially because one of the things that I noticed in your book was you really pull a lot of shame out. And I really like how you talk about failure, and we're not really failing. And I think you had said, I don't want to misquote you, so correct me, but the only way to fail is if we stop learning.
Right, right. Yeah. I take that quote from my Arnie Mindell, who's the founder of Process Work, which is the basis of the work that I do. And he says, learners can never be losers.
Yeah.
And I love that. And I really do object to this idea of failed relationships and people talking about their failed relationships. And I do see really the only failure being the inability to take something away that you can then use to grow from and to learn and to try again.
Yes.
You know, and try to do it differently, because I don't believe that many of us are trained in how to have relationships. It's not something that we learn in many of our childhood homes. We didn't see things modeled, and we don't learn in school. We don't have courses on it. And there's this expectation we're supposed to just know how to do relationship. I think that's absurd, to be frank. And I think people need a lot of help and a lot of training. And I know I have, and I continue to.
Yeah, and even as therapists, we find that we still need more of that as we go along. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I know with the way I am in relationships looks very different than from my pre-therapist years or even my early therapist years. And so, I mean, we learn so much along the way. And in your book, you bring so much of your own personal experiences and wisdom along with kind of what people can do to not only improve their relationships, but let them go if they're not working.
Right. Well, I decided that, as you know, because you read my book, I went through a very difficult period in my personal life. Well, many periods. I had a lot of ups and downs, and my relationship path was very fraught. It wasn't straightforward. I didn't meet a partner at a young age and stay with that partner for a lifetime. I had many relationships, and I suffered a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was that suffering and having come through a really difficult period that really inspired me to want to show that to other people, and to show that even as a therapist and as a so-called expert helping other couples, I was still struggling in my own personal life. And I really object, you mentioned shame, to the shame that people feel around messing up, or what they think of as failing in relationships. And I mean, one of my life missions is to bring couples issues out of the closet and to create atmospheres where couples feel more comfortable showing what they're really struggling with to the world, because I think that there's a lot that the world can learn from couples.
Absolutely. And I've gotten a lot of private emails with requests saying, can you interview somebody and talk about sex and relationships? And so
Oh.
even as therapists, we're struggling with this.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's so many relationship challenges and people are facing all kinds of various, different struggles and challenges with a lot of time together.
Mm-hmm.
And for some, that's really improved their relationships and
Mm-hmm.
they're feeling good about that. And for others, that has gotten really difficult. I'm wondering, do you have any tips for therapists or anybody navigating this?
So we're talking now about specifically during this COVID-19 pandemic, what we're
Yeah.
going through right now, that couples are stuck together,
Yes.
right? And
Unusual. Yes.
and for some couples, they're experiencing it as a really great time for
Mm-hmm.
the relationship. It's like a rejuvenation. It's like a rekindling of the passion and the love and the connection. And some couples feel like they finally have the time to spend together that they didn't have before. And especially, and some people feel the same way about family life, being able to be with their kids. So it's not the same for everyone. Whereas other couples where there were really pre-existing problems and struggles, it can become unbearable and be really, really difficult, especially when there's a lot of conflict. But not only when there's conflict, also when there's just an underlying sense of like emotional distance, when you have that much physical closeness, but you feel emotionally disconnected from your partner, it can, bring up a lot of painful stuff. I mean, you mentioned sex is the same thing. For couples who enjoy having sex together and have sort of similar levels of libido and similar interests and have basically good sex lives, here they are, and they have more opportunity, more time to catch sex when it wants to happen, whether it be in the middle of the day or unusual times when they wouldn't be able to before.
Mm-hmm.
But for other couples where there's more of a sense of mismatch, or where there's abuse in the background, or where they just don't like each other that much, or especially where people haven't felt that sex is always consensual, that they're doing their duty, then it can be even more additionally problematic. So basically what I'm finding is that the lockdown is just amplifying whatever is already there. So, I mean, did you ask me about tips to deal with this?
Yeah, if you have any tips or wisdom for couples that are dealing with this.
I mean, the whole thing, as a therapist, that everybody is so individual. And one of the things that I really do when I work with couples is really listen to their individual stories, hear what they're saying, study what their body language is saying, understand their implicit and their explicit communication, and then tailor my intervention or my tips to their specific situations. So it's hard to give generalized tips, right? But having said that, I'll give some generalized tips, right? So, you know, the whole thing about the boundaries is so important around sexuality, but really around anything. And I'm really finding that with the virus, it's amplifying our relationship to our boundaries, and that it's both about dissolving boundaries, obviously, because the virus crosses borders and is, you know, doesn't respect boundaries, so to speak, right? But on the other hand, it's really forcing us to look at our boundaries and to keep ourselves safe and to notice situations that don't feel safe to us. And sometimes it feels more like a matter of life and death to be able to really assert a boundary. Whereas before, we may have been a little bit more fluid or scared or not able to make boundaries. So I'm noticing that for some couples or for some individuals who had trouble saying no to sex, they have a reason to say no now. Because they can use, and it's not, they're not just using it, but the fact that their partner may have different safety practices outside the home, either because they have an essential job and they're going outside the home and the partner doesn't feel safe, or because the partner just doesn't feel good about how they're handling protocols in the grocery store, whatever it is. They can say, I'm not comfortable being physical with you because of the virus.
And blaming the virus.
Or using the virus to help support something that was hard for them to do anyway, but now they can. So I've seen couples where one of the partners is able to say, I'm going to sleep in a separate room, or I don't want to touch you, where they didn't really want to sleep with their partner before the virus, but they didn't have the ability to say that. So that's something interesting that I've noticed coming up.
Which will also be interesting as we start to come out of this and sit with those couples in our offices as well, when that, not that it's an excuse, but when that reason that they're using is not there anymore and that gets taken away.
Exactly.
And there's going to be an expectation that's been built by the other partner.
Or maybe the person who was able to assert that boundary was able to practice saying no, and that maybe they're developing a muscle and they're training themselves for something that then they can transfer. This is on the positive side, that maybe something useful comes out of that. And I think it's coming up, I mean, the whole thing with boundaries is coming up not just around sexuality, it's about relationships between family members, it's about how you deal with a child and with blended families and children who are going back and forth between families, and taking care of parents, and when you're willing to risk your life for something and when you're not.
Yeah.
And I think it's very, very powerful. It's very powerful. I mean, whenever I talk about this, I also just want to assert and say again, even though the virus doesn't respect boundaries, it does. The social inequities that are being highlighted and underlined because of the different impacts that the virus is having in different communities of color and poor communities. It's bad. You know, it's pretty upsetting. So the virus it may be an equal opportunity infector in the sense that it doesn't discern who it's infecting, the virus itself, but the outcome's not the same across communities. Yeah,
and we've definitely been seeing that.
Yeah. So I don't know if I answered your question about tips or not. You know,
I had one therapist who emailed me and wanted to kind of remain anonymous. So, and I think what her thing was kind of that more time together and really struggling with her partner's libido being much higher than hers. And then she's working with couples at the same time that are having this issue. And so she was really looking for, like, how do I navigate this? Like, she's getting some countertransference kind of stuff and struggling with helping them. So I think that's one of the things that therapists struggle with, right? Whenever we're working with couples and relationships and sexuality, whenever it hits on something that's similar to our own issue that we're still working on, of course that comes up.
Absolutely right. So I didn't address that part of your question. It had specifically to do with therapists. And I think that's a very interesting question. And obviously, depending on how you're trained as a therapist, you're going to deal with that differently. I mean, you mentioned the countertransference bit. It's always so important to notice when you're being triggered by your client's issues and to be careful not to be sort of acting out of that place unconsciously, right? So it depends also on what your relationship is to your own transparency as a therapist, because the way that I'm trained and the way I work, I do believe that it's sometimes appropriate to bring in, if I can really relate deeply to something that a client's saying, I might share that, or I might share that this is a really difficult issue that you're struggling with and there's no easy answer to it. I struggle with it myself. So having said that, because it normalizes your problem as my client, you feel like you're not crazy. Even the therapist struggles with this. Now, I wouldn't go into great depth necessarily. I mean, most of the time I would not go into too much depth about what my own issues are. But occasionally, if I develop over time a close therapeutic relationship with that client, it might be really, really powerful for the client to learn something more about me. And I'm finding that with more and more teletherapy and during this time, there's something that's more personal that's occurring between therapists and clients, where the client sees you in your own space and sometimes gets curious, or maybe your partner accidentally comes in, or your kid comes in the room, or just that's all of the unexpected weird things that happen actually can be used to create more of a relationship and build relationship between a therapist and a client. Now that's also to respect other styles. Like some therapists really have like very firm boundaries in that kind of way and don't want that. And that's okay too. The question about libido and when you have when you're stuck at home with a partner who has a different level of libido, it's really hard on both people.
Yeah.
It's just a really, really difficult circumstance. And as I said before, that problem was there before the lockdown. So the lockdown is just going to be amplifying it. Mm-hmm. And you have to find out, like, when there's a different level of libido or a different interest in sex, is it like just a natural difference? It's a diversity issue between people. For example, somebody is a more sexual being, and the other one is less of a sexual being. Yeah. And if that's the case, then there's got to be, then that couple really has to learn how to negotiate that. Mm-hmm. Is it something that they can accept? Do they need to open up if the love is really there and they really just love each other, but that's a difference that they have. Yeah. Do they need to open up the relationship? Does the partner who's not as into sex, are they willing to maybe pleasure the other person just because the other person needs it, because the goodwill is there and the love is there? Is there a compromises that can be worked out? That's a very, very different situation when the mismatch of libido is because of more of a problem, like this conflict in the background and one of the partners just doesn't want to be close. Yeah. Or because there's sexual problems and they either haven't been able to talk about, one of the people aren't getting the same level of pleasure from the relationship. And they haven't been able to talk about it. They haven't been able to negotiate it. Then that couple needs help to talk about some of those deeper issues. Or maybe there's a sex addiction problem and one of the partners feels like they're being used to fulfill a need of the other person that isn't really about relating. Or maybe they have different sexual interests. Maybe one of them is more into a sort of more so-called vanilla style, where the other one is more into BDSM or kink. Mm-hmm. So there's so many issues that are deeper than just the issue of a mismatch in desire. And it really has to be, like, a lot of times it's an indication of underlying relationship issues that need to be worked on. So this is the kind of stuff that when that's going on, it's really helpful to just go to a therapist, a couples therapist, and really work on the specifics of it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So one of the other questions that I got was from some therapists that are single and alone, and they're doing telehealth all day, and then they're still in their apartment or their home, and they're lonely.
Yeah.
And so just kind of, I guess they didn't really give me a specific question, just kind of that this sucks, and can you talk about this?
Exactly. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. We live in a world where being single is a kind of marginalized subgroup, minority experience, but it doesn't have much of a support group or an activism or a movement associated with that. And one of the, as you know from my book, that one of the things I write about is the experience of being single, a middle-aged single woman, and just feeling so alone in that. Yeah. And I know, and a couple's just the fact of being part of a couple is a privilege. It's a social privilege. And I think what's happening now for single people during lockdown is it's becoming even harder because friends who are coupled have even less energy for relationships on screens because they're spending, if they're still working, if they're working from home, or if they're, especially if they're a therapist and their friends are therapists and they're spending so much time on screens and they don't have time, they don't want to take the time, or they don't have the energy to spend more screen time for social life, for relationship life. And so I've also heard from single people and single therapists that they're feeling like their coupled friends aren't realizing how lonely they are and how much they need. So it's more of a call to those of us who are in relationship and who to see that as a privilege and to remember our friends and people in our community who are single, and that we should be the ones who are reaching out if we can. It's a way of using our privilege. So that's one thing that comes to mind. Yeah. Yeah,
and I've thought about that a lot as I look back on my life. There was a long period of time where I was single in adulthood, right, in my 30s. And if this had happened then, I think about just how hard that would have been, and the privilege that I do have to have a healthy partnership right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And people are also talking about touch hunger, you know, feeling like just not having that skin to skin contact. And I spoke with somebody who explained to me a person who was sheltering alone, who talked about an erotic relationship with her vegetables and marinating vegetables and connecting with food and going outside and hugging trees and finding ways to connect with nature or take baths or all the forms of self-care that I'm not going to go into because they're probably, especially for therapists, more obvious. But we need, not just single people, but especially single people, really need ways to try to connect with ourselves in positive ways and just try to, as much as possible, eliminate or mitigate the negative self-talk, which makes it even, because what's worse than being alone is being alone with your inner critic.
Yes.
Right? And being stuck at home with a part of yourself that doesn't like you. I mean, it's bad enough if, you know, many of us struggle with that. And when you have somebody around you who can help mitigate that, it's easier. Some of us have people around us who make that worse. So being in a relationship is not always a privilege. If it's a lousy relationship and your partner is very critical or hurtful or abusive in the worst case, it's obviously not a privilege.
Yeah, that's so true. Thank you for all of that. That is very, very helpful. And so I want to kind of shift gears back into kind of thinking about the pandemic. And I'm curious, as we start to see things open back up in the United States, what do you see as potential challenges for mental health providers as we kind of return to our offices and try and find a new normal?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, you know, I've been practicing telehealth for a long time because I was originally based in Switzerland. And when I moved back to the United States in the early 90s, I was maintaining some telephone therapy with clients back then. in Europe. And I think that we as therapists have an incredible advantage to see, at least I believe, that it's very effective, that working online is very effective.
Yeah.
And I think we can reach people, we can help people, we can facilitate, and we mustn't push ourselves as practitioners over our own boundaries. And we mustn't go back to the office until we feel really comfortable with the protocols that we can practice and that we can feel safe. It's like, put on your own oxygen mask first type of thing. Like, if we feel uncomfortable and we're going to be nervous in the environment with our clients, we're not going to be able to really serve our clients. So I think the biggest thing that I'm saying to myself and that I say to other providers is that pay attention to yourself and take yourself seriously, and don't go back until you're ready. You know, if you're able to, depending on what kind of situation you're working in. Not everybody has that ability, but if you're a private practitioner and you're working, you know, you're self-employed, you have that ability. So, you know, sitting the 6 feet distance part from clients, I don't think is going to be that difficult, but practicing therapy with a mask on, I'm not sure, you know, how that's going to feel. And I'm not sure if if I feel like I'd rather be, and I can feel more intimate with my client on a screen like we are now, than I would feel in an office with a mask on. Or I would feel if I'm sitting with somebody, but I'm distracted by my own fears.
Yeah,
So
I thought about that a lot too, right? If I'm sitting there with a mask on or somebody's wearing a mask, I don't know. I think it would be even harder to read those micro expressions, especially,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
Yes, we're missing the body language cues of the full body, but I think the micro expressions that we get on the face where the mask is really critical to do our work. So
absolutely.
I know for me, as I'm trying to kind of discern when to go back, or if I'm going to have a soft start, or what that's going to look like, I've thought a lot about that of, you know, okay, I can get to where I'm 6 feet apart from my clients, but I don't know that I can do the mask thing and be as effective.
Right. Exactly. And then don't, you know, that's what I would say. Then, you know, work it out. I mean, I don't know what I shouldn't, it's not so easy that just don't, because some people are employed by, you know, agencies and whatnot, and they have to at a certain point follow the rules. But wherever possible, I say it's always important for therapists to feel comfortable themselves, or we can't do the work with our people.
Yes, that's so true. And that's great advice for, as people are thinking about, those that have the choice, that are thinking about going back to in person, and the decisions that we all have to make with that. Yeah. So do you have any, you mentioned you have done a lot of telehealth. Do you have any other kind of words of wisdom that for people that are kind of maybe newer to telehealth in the last 3 months?
Well, one of the, I don't know if I have words of wisdom, but one of the things that I'm noticing as I'm working with more and more couples online is just to really encourage people to move around. That just because we're sitting and facing people, we don't have to only be like mannequins just sitting there. That, you know, for example, a lot of times when I'm working with couples, I'll notice they're both facing the screen and talking to me.
Yeah.
And one of the things I do when I'm facilitating couples is I help facilitate their communication, and I have my office set up in such a way that the chairs can move around, and it's not, I don't dictate the way that my clients sit together based on the way my furniture is set up. That's part of how I work, is that people are free to scoot around and either face each other or face me, and that gives me information. If the people are facing me and talking to me, I think, okay, they're talking to me because they need individual help with some of the issues that they have with each other. But if they're facing each other and they're starting to go at each other, then okay, this couple they need me to help facilitate their interaction with each other, and I got to help them with some of those communication skills. So I get information from couples based on the way they sit together. But in this format, I notice that they're, you know, they sit really crunched together, and they're facing it, and it's so unnatural. So so I ask them to move the screen back and to sit in a way that's comfortable for them. And so that I can see how they arrange themselves rather than having the screen dictate how they arrange themselves. So that's just one small thing that I've noticed. But in general, I do work a lot with the body, and I work a lot with movement and movement signals. So I also encourage people to get up, to move. If they want to, they have the advantage of, if they're sitting on a couch, they can lie down. They can lie down on the floor if they want to go into a meditative process. I just make sure that I don't just get fixated on the conversation that's happening like that.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. And I've seen that too. So
yeah.
Kind of laughing and and the variety, right? Because I've had some couples that are so much more affectionate on this platform too, that and I think, well, why do you not feel like you can be the affectionate in my office?
That's very interesting.
In their home environment, they feel more free to be affectionate or cuddly while they're talking to me, and I absolutely love that. I think it's lovely.
That's beautiful. That's really sweet. Yeah, that's great. I was just thinking also about a family that one of the family members, the squeezed together, right? But one of the family members is always drifting off the screen. And I'm spending all this time trying to get everybody in the family's trying to get that one family member to come into the screen. And suddenly I woke up, I thought, oh, this family member wants distance. Let me encourage them to actually go all the way out of the screen instead of trying to force them into the screen. This is information. Let me take this information seriously.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great information.
So it's like, just like you get signals, nonverbal signals, and all sorts of information from people when you're in your office, people are saying, oh, I'm missing all of this from being on a screen. You miss some stuff, but then you get other stuff that you wouldn't get.
Yeah.
Like you just described about the affection. So it's interesting to look for the positive on that also.
Yeah, that's so true. We do. We may lose some things, but we absolutely gain others.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm curious, because you were so vulnerable and authentic in your book, I wanted to ask you what you've learned about yourself in this process of going through a pandemic as both a healer and as a human being impacted by this.
Right. Yeah, what I've learned about myself. I mean, I don't quite identify as a healer. I think of myself more as a facilitator.
Okay.
And I think that what I've learned or relearned or learned more deeply is that I feel okay if I'm facilitating. And to facilitate means to make things more facile, to make things easier for other people. Like if I can contribute, if I can help others reduce their suffering, then I suffer less.
Yeah.
And it's just a really deeply ingrained thing in me. And I felt like if I could be useful, I felt like more called to try to be useful. And I felt like a lot of sort of generosity coming out of me in that way. And I think I don't know if I learned that because I kind of knew it about myself, but I also relearned it. But as I say it to you now, I'm learning something that I hadn't thought about before. So it's going to be very undigested. But it's also, I think I need to really explore what happens to me if I don't feel useful. And there's an even deeper vulnerability there in what if I'm just one of the, people who, what am I trying to say there? Maybe I'm getting into a place where I really haven't.
It's finding that intrinsic value, right? That value of just because you exist.
Exactly. And I think that's still, thank you. You're helping me now. You're being my therapist now. I really appreciate that. I think that that's absolutely right. And I think that that's still where my growing edge is to really find that. And the thing is also, the other thing that I just have really been focused on is, my privilege, my relative privilege, because I still have a job. I have I have people around, I have my health.
Mhm.
I'm not suffering so much um, from the pandemic as many people in the world are. And I feel like that's why, at least I feel like if I can give something back, I just want to. I really, really deeply want to,
Yeah.
and I don't want to be somebody who just sort of takes up space without contributing something. But I think there is something even deeper there about intrinsic value and self-love that I'm going to have to explore more on my own time.
And I'm glad that could bubble up and surface while we're talking today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I so agree with you about privilege, and we really need to pay attention to our privilege, and when we have privilege, to be able to use it in important ways. So I think we're at a time in history where that's becoming more and more relevant.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm just wondering if you have any additional words of wisdom or things that you wanted to share with us before we wrap up today.
I don't think so. I think this has just been a really great conversation. I really appreciate meeting you and talking to you, and your questions are great. And I think you're doing a great service by just creating these videos, and I hope people find some useful. I hope this is useful. That's my whole thing about being useful, right? Right.
Well, I also hope that it's useful and resonate with that.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yes, and I am going to put some links, especially a link to your book. And if anyone has any doubts, please read it. It is really amazing, and it's funny, and you will laugh, and you will probably cry. I did, and it's just, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. So thank you for writing that. Thank you for being on here. I so appreciate you.
You're very welcome. I really had a great time.
All right. This is Therapist Supporting Therapists. Please like and subscribe, and thanks for watching. Bye, everybody.
Bye.